confirmation also from my colleagues that we are also live on Facebook. Okay, I think we can start. General Clark, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this webinar on the world post-COVID-19. It is a great pleasure to have you tonight with us. Thank you very much for doing this. Before I make an introduction of the General, I would like that everybody would raise your hands in the second part of the session, and also send your questions through the Q&A, and then I will invite you to make your question to the General. At the same time, we will have lots of questions from Facebook that my colleagues will be bringing on to me, and I will try to read them, of course, time allowing to do as many as we can. We will have 40 minutes for this webinar, around a presentation, introductory presentation by the General Clark, followed by question and answers. Before we start, I just want to read the bio of the General. Wesley K. Clark is a businessman, educator, writer, and commentator who serves as chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, a strategic consulting firm. General Clark retired as a four-star general after 38 years in the United States Army, having served in his last assignments as commander of U.S. Southern Command and then as commander of U.S. European Command, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He graduated first in his class at West Point and completed degrees in philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University, both BA and MA, as a Rhodes Scholar. He worked with Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the Dayton Peace Process, where he helped write and negotiate significant portions of the '95 Dayton Peace Agreement. In his final assignment as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he led NATO forces to victory in Operation Allied Force, a 78-day air campaign backed by ground invasion planning and a diplomatic process, saving 1.5 million Albanians from ethnic cleansing. His awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Defense Distinguished Service Medal, 5 awards, Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Heart. In 2019, General Clark founded Renew America Together, a nonprofit organization designed to promote and achieve greater common ground in America by reducing partisan division and gridlock. I would ask all of you that you follow Renew Together on Twitter and Instagram, Renew Together America on Facebook, and sign up for the email list by visiting www.renewamericatogether.org. And without further ado, General Clark, I give the floor to you for your introductory remarks.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be with you. All of you who may be listening in. Kosovo is a very special place to me and for my families. I was there in June. I met with the president and the prime minister and saw a lot of people while Madeleine Albright got an award and President Clinton was there, and had my grandchildren there. So it's we feel like we're part of the family, and I guess that's good and bad. It makes me less objective and more passionate. And so I'm a big believer in Kosovo and the promise of democracy and economic development in Kosovo. We're talking here about the world after COVID. We don't know when that's going to be, but presumably in the next few months, people will be coming out from under the social isolation that I know is affecting all of us everywhere. And we're going to be trying to restore the world to normal. It won't quite be the same. Some things will be the same. I mean, China will still be pushing for its self-actualization to be recognized as the global leader. Russia will still be trying to undercut the democracies in Eastern Europe, NATO, and the European Union. The oil states in the Persian Gulf will be worried about the future of oil because as people are concerned about climate change, they're going to try to move away from oil. And so this is a real problem for these people in the Gulf. And in the United States, we'll be struggling through a presidential election. And depending on who wins, we'll be looking at the future. But for people everywhere, it's going to be like this. First of all, there are people who take this disease seriously, and there are those who don't. Those who don't, they're not keeping up with the news or the science of it. Actually, it's quite a deadly disease which has significant follow-on effects. COVID is now listed as officially the leading cause of death in the United States. So this is a serious problem. Italy, close to home, of course, there in Kosovo, has had major problems with COVID and is still suffering from it. So for those who don't take it seriously, they or their families are liable to contract the disease. And if they contract the disease, maybe they'll have a light dose. Maybe someone will be hospitalized or, heaven forbid, someone will die from this. But the point is, we don't know what the long-term effects are. People are struggling to create the vaccine and develop treatments for this right now. But as of now, there's really no effective treatment for it if you have a severe case. And there's no vaccine yet. And we just don't know what the science of this is. And maybe we'll have a vaccine, it will work, and that'll be the end of it. Maybe we'll have a vaccine that only halfway works. It might be like HIV, where you can get treatments, but you never really get rid of the underlying condition. So it is something that we have to be concerned about. I think it's going to make most people wary about getting back together in groups. I think it's going to make it hard for families to get together with their neighbors, to attend weddings and funerals, to travel abroad. I think an immediate impact in countries like Kosovo, of course, there's so many wonderful Albanian Americans, Kosovo Albanians living abroad and sending their payments back to Kosovo. And I know that that's hard for them because so many of them, I meet so many of them every time I've been in New York City. I mean, many of them are in the service industry. So they're working in restaurants and doing things like this. And that's been the hardest hit sector in the American economy. So it's going to be very difficult for them. It's going to impact on countries around the world where these so-called remittances are reduced. It's going to make it hard. I think it's going to teach the world that we can work remotely a little bit better than we have been. We have the technology, like this technology we're using today, to really have effective conversations. Of course, there's nothing like being together and shaking hands, but looking each other eye to eye. But this is pretty close, and we can reach more people this way. And so I think there'll be a boost in that, especially for things like education. I think you'll see more education classes online, and I think they'll be treated with greater respect for those who are already doing online education. Because the truth of it is, it's in most cases, it's 90% listening and learning and 10% class participation. And that can be done over a video teleconference, just like it can in person. But for the business, yes, there'll be travel again. I think there'll be much greater attention to medical issues and medical prevention in the future. So I think that in the medical system, in the medical science, we're going to see renewed respect for people who are risking their lives on the front lines in hospitals. And we're going to see greater appreciation for the benefits of science. I'm worried about the poor in the world because I think the overall global impact is, as one study estimated, some 500 million people who are struggling all over the world to climb out of poverty and move into the middle class are going to be thrown back into poverty on this. It's just the cumulative effect. We've already seen it in the United States. We created a multi-$100 billion private partnership program to pay companies so they could retain and pay their workforce, and it's already gone. It went to the biggest businesses, not to the small companies and restaurants and others who are so important in the American economy. And so there's a public outcry on this. And I think this is the start of many. I'm hoping that what will come out of this with is a better, kinder, more equitable world, one in which every person's treated with respect, regardless of his nationality, ethnicity, religious beliefs, and one in which people understand that we're all underneath the skin. We're all basically the same person. We're all trying to do the same things. And these incredible divisions of wealth that have emerged as a result of the private economy, we can deal with that. We have systems. We have to help each and every person live up to being all they can be with all of their potential. That should be the aim of human society around the world. For the first time in human history, we now have enough wealth in the world, despite COVID, that every single person could have a home, clothing, food, and education. And it's up to us in human society to find significance in our lives. I hope COVID will help us learn and achieve this aim. I'll stop there and let's take some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, General. You touched many important aspects. Just a quick follow-up question. Do you think the world is handling well the pandemic? Do you think the global reaction has been the right one? You have a very long and distinguished career in security, and you have long experience in this. So do you think we should have done something differently than what we have done as a
Well, I think in general, yes. I mean, we didn't take this seriously enough soon enough. Just think of it this way. If when COVID first started, the first 100 people who were infected were identified and isolated and kept isolated for 3-4 weeks, the disease might have gone away. Now, the tricky part of this disease is that you can be infectious before you have any symptoms. So it would take several different concentric rings of isolation to achieve this. And China didn't do it. And it was out of China really before we knew it. I was traveling in Europe in January and February, and I guess I was lucky. I mean, nothing happened to me, but it was already there then. So we have an early warning system, but it needs to be reinforced, and we need measures to deal with it. We've gotten a lot better at creating vaccines. I was looking at one of the studies that showed when the SARS epidemic occurred back in 2003, it took 18-20 months to really understand the disease and try to. Now we're going to have something in 6 months. So we've gotten much, much better. We have much more effective technology, but we'll be better still. We have to understand that in this age, in a global age, and that's the way we want it. We don't want to go back to individual, isolated, angry, warring countries. We want to be all connected in one humanity. But if we're going to do that, the nature of security changes. And so medical security becomes the challenge of the 21st century. This won't be the last challenge we face.
Absolutely. So there are questions coming in through Facebook and here as well. You can also do it directly to the General by raising your hand there. Just one more, if I may, a follow-up question on this. You mentioned education as one of the, I would say, perhaps to some extent, positive externalities of the COVID. What do you think are the positive things that COVID is bringing? For example, we have seen ceasefire in countries like Syria because of the virus. How this might impact societies, globally? Do you think that there will be some positive things that we will come up after this?
I think if we don't come up with those positive things, this COVID experience will be repeated with a much more deadly disease than COVID-19. I think this is a lesson for humanity. Now, I have to tell you that the forces that provoke conflict in Yemen or Syria or elsewhere are still there. So people won't want to learn these lessons. Institutions will want to do the same thing they've always done. They'll still look at certain groups as enemies. They'll still want to buy the weapons. They'll still want to, struggle for power and influence. So there's going to be an internal battle in each person about his conscience and what he learns. And as this disease strikes into families without regard to wealth, because I know wealthy people who've contracted this and died as well as poor people. And so it strikes into ruling families. The most powerful single person in Nigeria, the chief of staff of the president, I just saw where he had died of COVID. I knew him. He was a former London banker who came back to Nigeria. very intelligent man, very smart man, very powerful man, and he's gone. So you can imagine what the repercussions are on the people around him. So I think there's a strong force and a motivation to change, but I think there's equally strong resistance. So I think it's up to men and women of conscience to encourage the political leadership in each of their countries to learn the right lessons from this.
Absolutely. So we have a question here. Of course, when we have General Clark, it always goes back to Kosovo and his contribution. So the question is, what is the thing that you remember the most during the NATO campaign in 1999? Maybe a decisive moment for you then.
Well, of course, I couldn't get on the ground in Kosovo. I remember meeting the liberal KLA people in Paris during the Rambouillet talks. I remember Hashim Thachi came and met me at one point and said he would try to help us run our campaign. I remember being in Albania and seeing the Prime Minister, President Nano there. And I said, Mr. President, we're going to need to use one of your airfields. And he said, General, he said, you can have all of our airfields. Take anything you want in Albania. I mean, I didn't expect that response. It was wonderful. I remember when President Gligorov called me and he said, these Kosovar Albanians, they're flooding into my country and they're going to create instability here. You must do something. This was like 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I remember, the neighbors and how they reacted, the leaders in the NATO. But the thing I remember most is the courage of the people in Kosovo. I remember hearing about what was going on there, and I remember how awful it was when we had the mistakes that were made in the bombing. I felt so terrible about it. At one point, the officers came to me and they said, sir, we've identified a Serb military command post, and it's surrounded by Serb military vehicles, and we see the antennas there and everything, and we've flown over it twice, and we want to take it out. I said, okay, take it out. And it turned out it was a detention center for Kosovar Albanians trying to escape the country. And 80 people were killed. I remember those incidents like that. There was a convoy of tractors that were moving down the road, and they were stopping at each of the Kosovar houses, and they were setting them on fire. And the pilots looked at this from 20,000 feet up, and they said there are Serbs riding on those tractors and they're burning the houses, and so they attacked them. And the next day, Milosevic took the press down there and they showed pictures of these poor Kosovar farmers out there who had been killed in the airstrike. And the pilots came to me and they said, sir, this is not true. We didn't do this. We know these were Serbs on these tractors. And years later, I met a man who'd been in that convoy. And he said, I was in that convoy. I said, well, were you really burning the houses? He said, of course. I said, but why would you burn your own houses? He said, so the Serbs couldn't take them. So you understand this. I met people who fought with the New York Brigade of the KLA after the war, and they told me the incredible courage and hardship they went through and the dangers and their determination. No, you remember these things always, always. And of course, I remember coming into Kosovo with Javier Solana, and there was this incredible pandemonium in Pristina, and people surrounded us. And it was hard for Europeans who weren't involved directly in this to understand the sense of liberation that the NATO action provided. I had dinner with the ambassador from Kosovo to Washington last year on the 20th anniversary of the start of the bombing. And I said, well, why are we having this dinner in Washington at the start of the bomb? And she said, oh, General, she said, when we heard those NATO jets coming, we knew we would be free. People on the outside didn't understand that.
This is exactly, people on the outside, they don't really always understand this. And for us, it's wonderful. And when we posted this, we posted that we will be having this conversation with you. There's been an extraordinary reaction of people, and looking at the statistics, obviously, above 30 years old, there are those who are more enthusiastic because they have the experience of the war and they know what has really happened. So as a follow-up question, there is one question coming from Facebook, and there are questions coming here as well, but please, you can also do it directly. Just raise your hands and then I will unmute your microphone so you could direct the question directly to the general. But one question is, with the with the COVID pandemics and the rise of China, what would be the role of the alliance?
Sorry.
How do you see the alliance in that?
Well, NATO it's an absolutely vital interest for the United States. We have to nourish it and strengthen it. There have always been divisions and quarrels and unhappiness in the alliance. I'll give you an example. During the Kosovo campaign, in one meeting in in Brussels, the Greek ambassador came to me after the meeting. He said, General, he says, these factories you're bombing in Serbia, they're owned by Greeks. And I said, I'm so sorry, but they're producing trucks for Serbs. And so that's why we bombed them. And he said, yes, I understand. Well, of course, if it had been up to Greece, they would have stopped the bombing immediately because their people would have said, hey, you can't bomb. We own these factories in Serbia. Why are you bombing them? But NATO has a way of pulling people together in a crisis, and that's the strength of NATO. And we're going to need it even more because the security threats to our well-being in the world are broader than they ever were during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we were about, a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. It's so much more difficult today with fake news and Russian trolls and 5G technology coming in that threatens the control of and information security of nations. And then now we have the medical issues on top of this. And of course, there's still the possibility of warfare. We're just hearing from friends in Ukraine, and they've lost several soldiers over the last day due to renewed Russian involvement there and bombardment. And if you look at the situation in Idlib, where these poor people who rebelled against Bashar Assad in northern Syria have been pushed into this little pocket, and they were being attacked and bombed and so forth. The hospitals were being struck. It's still difficult, and we need a strong, unified alliance to be able to cope with these challenges. So I think NATO is going to be more important in the future.
Absolutely. General, we have had an overwhelming number of questions, actually, also through Facebook and from our own students about the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. I'm not sure if you have been able to follow recently the situation. We've had non-confidence vote in the government a few weeks ago. And the stance of Trump administration has been much more, I would say, aggressive during this time. I'm not saying negative sense, but it has been much more pushy than what we have seen in the past. We have also a follow-up question just here is that in regard to final deal, what is the format of the final deal between Kosovo and Serbia should be? And how do you evaluate the position of Trump administration towards Kosovo-Serbia dialogue?
Well, first of all, I don't want to say anything about the internal politics in Kosovo. Every country has its own difficulty. Democracy is tough, and you get your issues out in public and governments come and go. And I mean, look at what's happening in the United States. So nothing's easy in democracy, but it's the best form of government yet devised by mankind. So we're stuck with it, and we're going to try to make the best of it, and you will try to make the best of it in Kosovo. I'll just say this about the dialogue and what I'm hearing. So in the original structure in Yugoslavia, for whatever reason, north of the Ibar River was shoved into Kosovo by Tito, and Albanians moved there. And when I came into Kosovo after the conflict in '99, there were a lot of Albanians living in Mitrovica and north of there, and they were being forced out by the Serbs. And I went to the French Minister of Defense because France had been assigned that area, and he had told the French, don't do anything to stop the ethnic cleansing. The Serbs have to have a home in northern Kosovo. So I objected strongly to this. I went to the North Atlantic Council. I went to the Secretary of Defense of the United States. And so we tried to set up a policy of rotating forces in there to try to prevent this. And we were not very successful. We've tried, and I've seen over the years what's happened on this. The Russian action at Pristina Airfield was a Russian special operation designed to carve up Kosovo and give the northern part back to Serbia. The Serbs are always looked at this as this is the wealthiest part of Kosovo. It has the famous mines in there, the Trepča mines, and there's silver in those mines and zinc, and it must be, wealthy. There's a lot of sort of 19th century mineralogy thought on the part of the Serbs. When, the real wealth is the education of people. It's an educated workforce that's connected through the internet to the world. That's what makes a country wealthy. If you look at Singapore, for example, they're not exploiting minerals. They're just a bunch of smart people. And Kosovo could become the same way. But this hyper focus on the northern part. So I've watched this with some interest, and it's going to have to be sorted out. The question would be, if there were to be a territorial swap, what would it really change? Would it really ease the enmity? Would it stop the attempts by some outside powers to destabilize the situation in Kosovo? Would it take away the threat? Or would it simply be an appeasement of the threat? And what does it mean for the individual people in Kosovo? I mean, if you have, and your family have lived in some area for years and years, and you own property there, and suddenly somebody says, hey, that's a different country now. You're out. We saw what happened in 1948. I didn't see it. I was just a little boy then. But in 1948, India and Pakistan partitioned when Pakistan carved off from India, and millions of people lost their homes, and there was fighting and murder and deaths, and it creates a lot of instability. So if something like that were to be decided, there'd have to be a very high level of compensation for the individual people who are displaced by this. So it wouldn't be just like, okay, there's peace and don't worry about it, and I'm sure we're going to be accepted by the EU and et cetera. Individual people's family needs and personal histories need to be accounted for in a place like this. And so it makes it extremely difficult politically to determine what to do in this case. And so I'm hoping it works out the right way. But from the outside, I can't really say what that is.
Mm-hmm. And there have been two different opinions in this. One is that, this is a decisive moment for Kosovo. It's, to solve a 100 years old or 1,000 years old dispute with Serbia. This is one argument. And the other argument is that it's very, a quick fix. It's not a long-term fix. So do you think that this is the moment? Do you think that from of course from outside, this is the moment where we can really seize the moment and have a long-term peace with Serbia in this dialogue, now much more mediated by US than EU?
From the outside, it's really hard to say. But in order to have the long-term dialogue, there'd have to be some other understandings. For example, Russia, of course, does not want to see Serbia part of the European Union or NATO. And certainly they don't want to see Kosovo part of the European Union and NATO. And so what is Russia's role in this? And if an agreement were made, what would the Russians then do? Would they just say, okay, that's it, Serbs have decided it, okay, we're going to pull out? Or would they then do their best to undermine it? What kind of guarantees would be in place that a territorial swap would lead to longer term, better relations that would end this enmity and conflict? Or would it simply be an appeasement? We don't know that. I don't know that, and I can't work it. But those would, if I were on the inside, I'd be asking those questions. And I'm sure American diplomats, some of them are asking those questions. I'm sure the leadership in Kosovo is asking those questions. I certainly hope so.
We are receiving a lot more questions, actually, both here in the Q&A as well as on Facebook. But once again, you can also talk directly. So we have Uran. I will just unmute. Uran, go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, I can.
Okay. Hello, General, and thank you for being part of this web conference. I have a question regarding the change of generation. And you see a lot of key figures during the 1999 war. They either retired or now they're not involved in the politics. But at the same time, you see a lot of people in Kosovo who the United States had a special relationship, either retiring in Kosovo as well. So my question is, for the new generation in Kosovo, how do they approach the U.S. politics, which sometimes can be very divisive, and they don't know who to approach and how this approach should be? Thank you.
Well, I think that's a really great question, and it's a very difficult question to answer. Of course, you've got lots of friends in the United States in politics from that period, especially in Congress, the Senate. The executive branch turns over, of course, every 4 years or 8 years, and parties come in and go, and new people have to be educated. And so I think you have to approach the United States not as someone seeking aid. You could be a modern country. I mean, so many people now are so well educated, they speak English. You've got so many expatriates who are living in the West that influence American politics, for example. And yet, what you have to do for the United States is educate the United States. We always need your perspective. So when you come to the United States, don't be trapped by a single political party, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Work across the so-called aisle of separation between the two parties. Deal with people in both parties. Explain what your interests are, what your needs are. Educate people in the United States on your histories, on your personal history. Tell them what it was like if you were a little boy or a young man during this fighting and the conflict, what it was like, because Americans have never been through anything like that. They have no real conception of this. So give them a sense for what your world is like, and then if America understands you better and your interests better, you're going to get better support from the United States, regardless of who's in power. I'm looking at myself on my own screen. Am I still being transmitted, or did something happen to my own view here?
You are. I just made it as a highlight because we're going on Facebook, and okay. I saw that there were changes, so I made the video as a highlight. So it was only your video. Dardan, do you want to ask a question directly, the one that you posted here? You can just raise your hand, and then I could give you the floor, or I could just read it. Honorable General, if the air war was a modern war, but what can this pandemic war of today be called?
Well, some people are calling what's going on today hybrid warfare. That is to say, it's a very tight collection of different policies. So you have information policy or propaganda or active measures, some people call it, so that fake news is put out, opinions are changed, democracies, votes are interfered with, and then that goes up the scale into economic suasion, buying of politicians, preferential investment treatments, and so forth, and all the way up to sort of the underlying threat of military intervention. And this is the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, that was became very well known after the Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine in 2014. And we're looking at that. And at the same time, the world has turned away from the Middle East. And so for 20 years in the United States, we were focused on so-called counterinsurgency, anti-terrorism, how to go after terrorists. So we always had a big technological edge, and but we were in foreign countries. And now what's changed in the world is there are peer competitors. Russia, with technology that's almost as good as the United States, in some cases maybe better. China, which is catching up rapidly and trying to excel. And each country has their own interests. Under the so-called, under the Russian doctrine of Yevgeny Primakov, when he was foreign minister and briefly prime minister, Russia said they would not accept NATO leadership in Europe or U.S. leadership in the world. They wanted a multipolar world in which power centers were contending with each other. In other words, Russia wanted its security sphere around its borders, countries that it could control. Yugoslavia was always on the fringe of that. I remember President Milosevic telling me that Russia was a very good friend of his. And so what you had is, you had a brief period of time during the 1990s and early 2000s when the United States was the unquestionable, unrivaled superpower. And now you have two other powers who want a share of world leadership and are willing to deploy forces, make investments, and interfere in other countries' internal affairs in order to get it. And so that's the nature of international struggle today. Do I think there's going to be another war, a big war between these major powers? I sure hope not. I don't see it, but you have to think about the worst in order to make the best happen.
General, there is one question I want to transmit from Nita. She says, I have read that you have spent 5 years training leaders and soldiers at the NTC. My question is, what is one of the most important leadership skills that the future generations need to consider? Thank you.
Well, it's hard to pick just one leadership skill. But what I learned in the Army was what one of my bosses always called Rule 14. He said, when in charge, take charge. And that means you accept responsibility. So it means if you're a leader, you're supposed to know what you're trying to accomplish. You're supposed to have a plan. You're supposed to communicate that plan. You're supposed to help it be executed or implemented. And then as it's implemented, you watch and modify it if it doesn't work out the way you want it to. But most importantly is you accept your responsibilities as a leader. That's what we always taught in the United States Armed Forces. Now, when it gets to the political level, sometimes it's a little bit different because sometimes people in elective politics, they don't want to accept responsibilities. They might get voted out of office. So there's a lot of finger pointing and pushing and shoving back in other directions. And that's the nature of politics. But leadership, pure leadership, good leader always has a plan, takes responsibility, does his best to execute that plan for the purpose of whatever he's leading, for the benefit of the soldiers, for the benefit of the battalion, division, or corps, for the benefit of the country. And he accepts his responsibilities if he succeeds, or if he or she succeeds, or if they fail.
One more question, General, and I think then we will have the last one. We agreed on 40-minute window, and we're very grateful for this. The question is, what General thinks about the human society? Will human society change after when this pandemic will be gone?
I hope human society will change. I hope we'll become a kinder, better species. You know, it's been a long struggle. If you look at mankind's record, most technology, the technology that really brought us out of being hunter-gatherers in the forest, was about human organization. And we went through an organization of society where one person had to be dominant and everybody else had to be like a serf living on a farm and being slaves to the land. And that was feudalism. And then we went into the industrial age and people went into factories and they were just like industrial serfs. They were chained to a machine working for somebody. And now we're in the age of knowledge and information. And what COVID is doing is further dispersing mankind away from structured authority and giving people more chance to contribute and develop as individuals. The technology, like this technology, makes that more possible. And I hope with that will come a greater respect for individuality, a greater respect for each other, and a greater recognition of our common humanity.
Okay. Do we have any questions here? Okay, Chandresa. Okay, Chandresa. Okay. I think I have unmuted you, Chandres. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Aritan. Mr. Clark, it's really an honor to have this opportunity to have this conversation with you and to ask you questions. I'm Chandresa Kukai. I would like to ask a question about the current political behavior in Kosovo, as I believe you're very familiar with the situation. During this COVID-19 crisis, there's also a political crisis in Kosovo, and different political actors are using the crisis to make their political moves. So in such times, I would like to know what message do you think this kind of political behavior sends to the people, and how does it affect the moral standards of doing politics in Kosovo for the future? Thank you.
It's an important question, but I can't answer that question. I'm not there and I can't see it. I do know people on all sides of these issues, and everyone professes their sincerity, their desire for the best outcome for the peaceful people of Kosovo. And there are various political stratagems that are in use. And I know it's painful to go through this, but this is democracy. So, I just encourage each and every one of you who is a member of society there and a voter there to make your own feelings and judgments known to those who are in positions of authority, so that the will of the people can be implemented there. I think that's the only thing I could say about it.
General, I just want to conclude with a final question. We started this with a COVID, and obviously we moved a bit to Kosovo because of your special relationship that you have with Kosovo. I want to ask a final question, which also comes from one of the participants, is what is your advice from your both security, leadership, and business experience? What would be your advice in terms of both economics as well as security issues to the Kosovo government at this stage? How to handle better the COVID as well as the overall relations in the region?
Well, I think you have to be cautious in pulling people out of social isolation. Because if some people get this disease, they don't even know they have it. But some people get it and die from it. It's a very strange disease. And so I think you have to be cautious. And I would not want to be the leader of pulling people out of isolation on this. I'd wait and see how it works out in other countries that surround me. I'd be learning lessons from their experiences on this. Economically, of course, I think that Kosovo will prosper as the rest of the economies in the world prosper. There's a lot of people I know who want to invest in Kosovo, and I don't want to get into any of those specific issues, but there are opportunities there, and I hope the people of Kosovo who are living abroad, who are working in Detroit or Staten Island, living there in New York City, and have access to businesses there and investment capital there, will always look back to your own country of Kosovo and look to bring those resources home to Kosovo to invest and build businesses. And everything from Pizza Huts and fast food franchises to automobile repairs to investments in major industries, technology, and the internet and so forth. Education is the most important thing for the future of Kosovo. When I was there at the American University of Kosovo a couple of years ago at the graduation, it was just so wonderful to see all those young people getting a good education. And on other trips, I've seen people sent to the United States on intern programs. I mean, the stronger relationship we can have, the better the education, the greater wealth and opportunity will come to all the citizens of Kosovo. And that's what I'd be thinking about economically and security-wise.
General, such a great honor to be with you for these 45 minutes. I want to really thank you on behalf of our students, on behalf of our staff, and on behalf of the whole Kosovo for being with us, not tonight for 45 minutes, but for being with us for over 25 years and more. And we look forward to strengthening this bond in the years to come. For the audience, once again, you can stay in touch with General through social media, Renew Together in Instagram and on Twitter, Renew Together America on Facebook, as well as Renew Together America.org, and you can sign up for email newsletter. Thank you very much once again. Real honor to have you tonight with us.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
God bless all the people of Kosovo, in Kosovo and everywhere else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.